Ladies and gentlemen, our closing speaker is Hilary French. She has a really difficult job. First of all, because she's a closing speaker, but the second reason is that she has to explain to us what's going to happen in Paris in a couple of months. So that's a really tough job, but she's up to it. She is the United Nations Environment Programme's Regional Office for North America, where her work focuses on climate change, air pollution, green economy, and resource efficiency. She has been a special advisor to the United Nations Environment Programme, and she has co-authored 15 of World Watch's annual State of the World reports. So, come, please. Tell us what's in our future.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, but also, of course, Joe and Nancy and all the people who have organized this extraordinary day plus of conversations. I'm really, been very delighted and honored to be part of such a rich dialogue. It's nice to be back in Minnesota. Joe invited me here, I think, 15 years ago, so it's always a pleasure to be here, and there's certainly a spirit here that's a bit different than that which I encounter in my daily work in Washington, so it's great to be here. As has been said, it is a bit of a challenge to be the last speaker after such a rich day of discussion. I also was thinking about it, and I think it's perhaps not entirely a coincidence that I am the last speaker because of the subject matter which I've been asked to address, which is meeting the environmental challenge within the United Nations. And as you all know, this is the 70th anniversary of the UN, so it's a good time to sort of reflect upon the UN as it was envisioned when it was set up, but also where it's headed. And to get to my point about being the last speaker, the environment is a bit of an afterthought, I think, or it certainly was an afterthought in the minds of the UN framers. In fact, it wasn't even mentioned, and there's a good reason for that, because the world of 1945 was a world where environmental issues had not yet reached people's consciousness as national environmental issues, let alone as global environmental issues. So it's only in those intervening years that we have come to see the environment as a critical challenge at all levels of governance, but including at the global level. And I think the UN has actually been quite adaptive in a certain sense in that it has certainly embraced environmental issues, even though the word environment doesn't appear in the charter. And this year in particular, you could almost argue is sort of the year of the environment at the UN, or the environment and sustainable development, I should hasten to add, because the two concepts are very much intertwined. But 2015 is actually a very big year for the way environmental issues are being addressed at the UN, both because of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals exactly 2 weeks ago in New York, and also because of the Paris conference coming up in just about 2 months, a little under 2 months now. So it is a big year, and to return to one of the themes that's been mentioned here today, the kind of best of times, worst of times theme that's run through the conference, this very much applies, I think, to the situation we face with the environment as it's addressed in the global arena today. Because in some ways, as I've said, I think you could argue it's the best of times because of some of the landmark events that I just mentioned. And of course, I'm going to talk about them in more detail as my remarks proceed here. But it's the worst of times in that the problems themselves are really beginning to hit home in a very dramatic way. So problems such as climate change, such as health damage caused by environmental factors or aggravated by environmental factors, air pollution, water pollution, and the like. These are old problems, but they're very present problems as well. Over 7 million deaths every year, according to the World Health Organization, for example, can be attributed to air pollution alone. other problems as well. The loss of biological diversity, 20% of the world's vertebrate species are currently under threat. So I could go on, it's sort of a litany, but clearly there's a whole pressing list of environmental challenges that the UN has made a valiant effort to solve, or at least to address meaningfully over the last 30 years or so, or actually longer, since the 1972 conference. The Stockholm Conference is what really put these issues on the map for the UN about 40 years ago now. The good news is the issues are very much on the agenda. The bad news is we just have a tremendously long way to go if we're going to actually succeed in solving these problems. And as has already been mentioned, climate change, I guess, is particularly rising to the top of the global agenda. We've seen many years are now setting new records as the world's warmest year, in 2014 being the most recent. So there's a clear warming trend underway, and we're beginning to see, I think people are waking up to some of the implications of this in terms of storm damage, losses of agricultural productivity, threats to human health, and the like. So I don't want to go on at too great length about the problems, but just to say we face this, this kind of irony in a certain sense that, or maybe it makes perfect sense as the problems are becoming more urgent and more widely understood. I think the good news is we are beginning to see a political response, albeit later than we wish and still insufficient. So just to focus on the first of the two big events that are happening in 2015, and the one that's actually already happened 2 weeks ago, the General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as the successor to the Millennium Development Goals. And a few people have mentioned this as an important development. I frankly didn't really expect it was going to happen because there was a move at the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012. That's where the process of negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals was launched. But the UN, in all its wisdom, had an entirely parallel process going on at that time to figure out which goals would replace the Millennium Development Goals, which of course had been driven much more by a straight poverty agenda rather than an environmental one. And for a while, these two discussions were proceeding on separate tracks, and I thought probably the sort of traditional development perspective would win out. But at the end of the day, I think the world did understand that these issues are in fact intertwined, and that you can't talk about poverty alleviation without talking about addressing environmental decline, and you can't talk about addressing environmental decline without dealing with poverty, and that's kind of what sustainable development is all about. So at the end of the day, these are called the Sustainable Development Goals. They're also being called, it's also being called the 2030 Agenda now. So we've moved past the post-2015 agenda, and now the 2030 Agenda has been embraced. 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 associated targets that cover a whole wide range of issues, education, energy, food security, gender, all sorts of things, but ones that are particularly relevant to the environment include a goal on climate change, one on sustainable consumption and production, and also one on ecosystems. The fact these goals have been adopted, I think, is important. One thing that's also very important to recognize is that these goals depart from the Millennium Development Goals in one quite important respect. Besides the fact they're being called Sustainable Development Goals, they're also universally applicable. So the Millennium Development Goals were intended to really, and were specifically aimed at addressing issues of relevance to developing countries, and they were framed that way. But the Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted by the entire world community, and President Obama stood up in front of the General Assembly 2 weeks ago and said he understood that the Sustainable Development Goals needed to be implemented by the United States of America. So this is a departure from the way things have worked in the past. I mentioned that one of the Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 12, focuses on sustainable consumption and production patterns. And this, of course, is a huge topic, but it is, to some extent, an underlying set of issues that are linked with all of the various problems I mentioned at the outset, whether it's climate change or air pollution or water pollution or biodiversity loss or overfishing or what have you. A common thread is unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. So we were, at UNEP, were quite excited that this goal was adopted as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and UNEP has a whole, well, it's not just UNEP, there is a UN-wide program for which UNEP provides the Secretariat now, called the 10-Year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production. This was launched at Rio Plus 20 in Rio in 2012, but will now very much serve as kind of the implementation or delivery mechanism for goal number 12. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but I guess the point here is that although we, of course, have a hugely long way to go, it is encouraging that these programs are getting underway, and at the core of what we call the 10YFP are some specific programs to address things like sustainable lifestyles and education, consumer information, sustainable public procurement, sustainable tourism, sustainable buildings and construction, and one on sustainable food systems that's going to be launched later this month. So that's a quick snapshot of the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals that have now been adopted. But as was mentioned in the introduction, of course, all eyes now are on Paris, or will soon be on Paris, because it's coming up very soon now, what those of us sort of in the inside of these processes call COP21, which means the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 21st one. The climate treaty, for short, was adopted by the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, so this has been going on for quite a long time now. And essentially, there have been various efforts to strengthen it over the years. The good news is that that first UN Framework Convention on Climate Change adopted at Rio actually was ratified by the United States, and this was when President Bush was president. So in this day and age, that would probably never happen, that it got ratified by the US Senate, because it's very difficult to get any treaties, especially environmental ones, ratified by the US Senate. But this particular treaty did get ratified. So the U.S. is a party to it. But then some of you will remember that the Kyoto Protocol came along in 1997, which was where we were supposed to get serious about really having binding reduction targets and such. And the U.S. Signed the Kyoto Protocol, but ended up not ratifying it. The next President Bush, his son, actually withdrew it from consideration for ratification. And ever since that happened, we've had a situation where the Kyoto Protocol did actually eventually enter into force, mostly, particularly with European support. However, you had some of the most important contributors to climate change that weren't part of the agreement, the United States being one. Developing countries also were not held to reduction commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this is a complicated issue, and there were good reasons for that, because developing countries currently emit much less on a per capita basis than industrial countries do. But that being the case, it's also true that most of the future growth in emissions is going to come from developing countries. China is now the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, for example. So we had a pretty serious problem that the world's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, China now and the United States is number two. It used to be flipped the other way around. The United States and China were not held to restrictions under this treaty. And what's happening in the run-up to Paris is this is supposed to change. So a little bit like the Sustainable Development Goals that are now universal in that they apply to industrial countries, it's a little bit the flip side. We're trying to make the climate treaty universal in that developing countries will also take on commitments under the new climate treaty that's expected to be adopted in Paris. And this is definitely a very important development if we're going to end up being able to solve the problem, because right now we've got a long way to go. Emissions are not on track to solve the problem. So I think that's the good news. There's sort of an irony. We've been talking a lot about global problems and global solutions, and I remember still from the era of Kyoto when the certain interests, I won't name them, were trying to prevent it from being taken seriously in this country and ratified, and there was an ad campaign. And the tagline was, "It's not global and it won't work." But it wasn't the World Federalists that were pointing this out. It was actually the corporate interests mostly that weren't very interested in seeing this adopted. But the truth is, it's true. It wasn't. It was a global treaty, but the commitments were not global. And that problem, we think, is going to be addressed in Paris. So that's very good news. There is a big question about, still, as I mentioned, to what extent the commitments that are taken on will be up to solving the problem. And to be honest, I think most observers do not expect countries in Paris to take on commitments that are aggressive enough to actually put the world on the track to meeting the target of keeping the global rise in temperature to under 2 degrees. That target has been agreed to internationally. So that's the bad news. The good news is most observers feel that we are creating a new architecture in Paris that hopefully over time will make it possible to get the world on track as technology evolves, for example, and as countries and governments are prepared to take on tougher commitments. And without getting into the details, the whole approach has been switched. So rather than targets that are being agreed to globally, this is, in a sense, a more voluntary approach. Countries are putting forward their own pledges. They're called intended INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. So every country is putting forward their own target, but then the goal is that there's going to be international accountability for how these are achieved. So that's a quick synopsis of what's happening with Paris. I also wanted to mention just one other area that I think has been promising in recent years, and that is the development of partnerships, sort of innovative partnerships outside the official UN kind of strictures that have succeeded, I think, in moving several issues forward in sort of innovative ways. These are sometimes called coalitions of the willing or coalitions of the working. But this is cases where you get select countries together along with members of civil society, the private sector, academics, whoever is sort of on board to try to solve certain problems. And there have been a few cases where these have been very successful. One that I might flag is the Partnership for Cleaner Fuels and Vehicles, which has succeeded in the space of just over 10 years since the Johannesburg Rio+10 summit in phasing out the use of lead in gasoline around the world, which is a huge public health gain. And now a similar model is being used to phase out the use of lead in paint, which is actually still happening in quite a few countries around the world, despite the evidence of what that does to kids' IQ and so forth. So this model, I think, can work. Another example would be an initiative that UNEP actually leads called the Enlighten Initiative, which is spreading energy-efficient light bulbs quite rapidly around the world. So a lot of the actual work is getting done in these sorts of partnerships and initiatives, I would argue. So finally, just to kind of conclude here, and I think I might even be ahead of schedule, but I'm sure nobody will object to having more time for discussion. To return to the kind of question or the theme of the best of times versus the worst of times, I think maybe the best of times is a bit of an exaggeration, but this year is a very important year, as I've already said, and I think the decision to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals and the widespread expectation that we will have a new universally applicable climate treaty adopted in Paris in December. These are both very important developments that offer us an important foundation upon which we can build. And I heard actually one of the most important people in the negotiations, the climate ambassador from France, which is hosting the negotiations, speak a few weeks ago. And she made the point is really the road from Paris, not the road to Paris, that is going to be critical. And I think that's true that applies to New York and the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Now it's the road from New York or the road from the adoption of these goals. Essentially we have an opportunity now. We have some structures that we can use to try to begin to get some of the actual concrete initiatives going on the ground that are actually going to succeed in solving some of these problems. And I think it's very encouraging that we've had such an interesting discussion today, and so many younger people involved too, those of you that are students here at this university, for example, because you're going to be the ones that are going to have to figure out how to do this in large measure. But I think that as political will builds, which it is building, I think that's also the good news, as public awareness grows of the threats and as political will gradually builds, we will come up with ways of actually getting these problems under control. So thank you very much, and happy to take some questions. If there are any questions. Yes. 2 words. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Human overpopulation.
Uh-huh.
Is that a sensitive topic at the UN? Does it enter into the
Right.
2030 goals?
Good question. And by the way, I should say that I am speaking in my personal capacity rather than although I don't think anything I've said is anything that UNEP probably wouldn't say, but population, it does figure into the goals, not in as prominent a way as some people would probably think they should, in that there's not a standalone goal on population. However, there is a target on things like access to family, I forget exactly how it's phrased, but it has to do with access to family planning, women's empowerment, education, and we've learned over the years that these are some of the most important things you can do to try to bring down fertility rates around the world. So it is addressed. UNEP doesn't directly take on population too much. For one reason is because there is the UN Fund for Population Activities within the UN, whose whole full-time job is to address population issues. Any other? Yes.
Here, I could give you the microphone. How will UNEP and the Paris meetings target and help overcome the specific roadblocks that exist to a more profound international cooperation in reducing emissions? I mean, could you identify from your perspective or UNEP's perspective, what are the major roadblocks for a really serious global cooperation on reducing our global ppm of atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions? And how can we overcome those blockades?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I would say that, you know, one of the big challenges, I mean, we're dealing with big parts of the economy, particularly the energy economy, of course, which is where most of the carbon dioxide emissions come from, not exclusively. Forestry plays a role as well. But, you know, there are big challenges in sort of decarbonizing the global economy is sort of the buzzword, or one way of putting it. But that means shifting out of fossil fuels into, or dramatically reducing reliance on fossil fuels, increasing reliance on renewable energy, dramatically improving energy efficiency, all these things, and they're not changes that take place overnight, is the bad news. The good news is that there are very rapid advances being made on all of these technologies that I've just mentioned. And so I guess it's a matter of how do we scale that up, get it happening faster than it's currently happening.
I have a question. Oops, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Hilary, I just wondered, two questions. One is how much weight is being placed on the blue economy? In the COP21 discussions coming up.
Right.
And secondly, what weight is being given to SIDS and the agenda that SIDS has with respect to, you know, issues of climate change and, of course, the vulnerabilities that these small states face?
Right. Good questions. The blue economy, and then also SIDS, which for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym, is the Small Island Developing States. And the Small Island Developing States, kind of from the beginning of international attention to this problem, have been very powerful spokespersons for the importance of the problem, because how can you deny the urgency of a problem when the president of the country stands up before the United Nations as the president of Maldives, I think, did in 1988 or something like that, and says, my country is going to be swamped, literally. And that is the truth of the matter. You know, sea level rise is one of the most serious impacts of climate change. As the polar ice caps melt, the seas are rising, and that's going to swamp low-lying areas, including entire countries in the case of some of the small island developing states. So as a result, they've been a very active voice in the negotiations, which has, I guess I would just say, been very helpful to raising people's consciousness of the importance of the problem. And they've also had a positive effect on the sort of the negotiating bloc between the developing countries, because, there have been big differences of view between different countries, that have been, some of which have been hesitant to take on reduction commitments, but others, such as the small island developing states and many developing countries. I mean, they're sort of torn. On the one hand, many developing countries are hesitant to take on reduction commitments when their current level of emissions is so much lower per capita, as I mentioned, than is true in industrial countries like the United States. But at the same time, the impacts of climate change are going to be felt in a particularly strong way in some of the poorest countries on Earth. So that's not exactly addressing the small island developing states per se, but Africa, for example, is going to be hit very hard. So you have these two things going on, but I think that part of what is slowly but surely, I think, beginning to change this whole conversation in a direction that's leading to real change is that all around the world, people are concerned about what the impact of climate change is going to be on their societies. So it's not seen as sort of any kind of a north-south issue, or it's, it's sort of a universal issue and a universal threat. And that's finally sort of mobilized people to get ready to get serious about submitting these so-called nationally intended, or whatever I called them. I can't remember the acronym, but yes, right, INDCs, thank you, intended nationally determined contributions. So, and in this country as well, we're seeing, I think, some movement with the Clean Power Plan and such. So that's kind of a quick answer on SIDS, but you may be more of an expert than I, being from one, I gather. And the blue economy, I guess you're referring to oceans issues and such. And UNEP has done a fair amount of work on that subject of the blue economy. I'm not personally sort of an expert in it or that familiar with it, but definitely there is work being done on that. Yeah.
Ms. French, it seems to me that the forces of corporate capitalism are so strong, and they're the #1 polluters and contributors to climate change. It seems to me, realistically, the only force or forces which can counteract them is the religious community. Pope Francis was here 2 weeks ago, and I hear that from people. By just making a statement about climate change, I think he affected more minds in America, at least, than a lot of us for 50 years of activism have done. And I know, does the UN Environmental Program or the UN at the level of Secretary General, I know you have to stay out of politics and religion, but can the UN provide advocacy with religious community leaders around the world?
Right.
I mean, we are running out of time.
Right.
So I don't care what religion they are, but, but can we go and try to convince them?
Right. Yeah, no, well, it's an important point. And certainly there are very important sort of issues of values that underlie all of these challenges, because sustainable consumption and production is sort of embedded into our society. Corporations are producers, but we're all consumers, face it, maybe at different levels. Maybe some of us consume more than others or whatever, but, we're all kind of part of this in a certain sense. So I think that we do need to address one of the underlying, or a very powerful part of the underlying picture here is the value system in which we live and in which the economy functions. And certainly the religious community is particularly well placed to speak to that. And I couldn't agree more that Pope Francis is raising the level, his very powerful statements, the encyclical and such on this topic, and showing, and his speech to the UN General Assembly as well, have been extremely important, both here and domestically, politically, and also internationally. And, of course, there's a role for other religious leaders as well. I don't know, I think the UN has sponsored some dialogues of religious leaders, faith leaders, but I'm not up to speed on sort of the latest with that. Yes.
You had mentioned, and I've seen studies about how a lot of the developing countries, poorer countries, it's one of their largest concerns moving forward is climate change, because it does affect their economies, it does affect their standard of living moving forward, much more so than, say, the United States and other Western countries. How can we as a group, especially my age group, move forward in trying to develop sustainable policies, or spreading the word to people who don't feel like they're being affected by climate change?
Good question. One thing, I'll just throw out the word in case you haven't all heard of adaptation to climate change policy. Kind of falls into two main baskets: mitigation, which has to do with trying to reduce emissions by changing energy technologies and such, and adaptation, which to some extent basically concedes we're going to have climate change and says that we need to protect people from its worst effects. We need people to be prepared. And for a long time, it was kind of it was a bit politically incorrect to even talk about adaptation because people felt it was kind of accepting that we're, kind of accepting defeat or something. But that attitude has actually changed quite a bit in recent years as people have realized we are facing climate change, and we're going to face more of it before we hope it won't. We hope we will generate a political response that will head off the worst effects of climate change. But we are committed to some degree of climate change, and people can be protected from its ravages. Storm damage, for example, you quickly get into, it melds very quickly with just the field of disaster preparedness, of which there's a long history and quite a bit that can be done. So that's just to say that adaptation is actually a very important piece of the climate change conversation and is embedded in the treaty as well at this point. Developing countries feel that not as much as, or particularly developing countries feel that not as much has been done on adaptation. They feel that that part of the agenda gets kind of short shrift. So that's part of the politics running up to Paris. However, that wasn't really your question. I think your question was that developing countries in a way seem to understand this, but maybe in this part of the world there's less concern really about the problem because we can protect ourselves from the worst of the damages. And that's an interesting point. I mean, I think what we're actually seeing is that the more marginalized communities, even in industrial countries, can't protect themselves. So there's sort of an environmental justice element to this, which has become quite powerful. I was at the National Adaptation Conference or something like that. It was called actually it was in St. Louis, just down the river here, a few months ago. And there were a number of activists from, kind of impoverished parts of the city that were particularly eloquent. People, of course, have seen the damage in places like New York from Hurricane Sandy and New Orleans and such. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think the damage is going to, and the risks is going to be evident here as well, but it might not be with kind of the more elite part of the population can probably protect themselves. So part of the answer may be giving a voice to more marginalized communities within our own society.
Question. I got the mic here. Maybe you could take this back to the United Nations. I wonder how much awareness there is that it is not fossil fuel burning that is a primary cause of global warming. It is the agricultural industry. Over half of our air pollution comes from that source. And if you want more information, go to the internet and watch the documentary called cowconspiracy.com. Cowspiracy is one word, .com, and you'll learn, it'll shake you up. I tell you, I never saw such a impressive documentary as this one.
Do you want, should I respond or take a few?
I have a question for you.
Well, I guess I would just say that, yes, I mean, I think, I don't want to get into the numbers in part because I don't have them at my fingertips. I think fossil fuels are an important part of the problem, but agriculture is also a key piece of the equation. And I think that, yeah, well, I don't know about that, but yeah. Right. But there is methane, for example, is another greenhouse gas besides carbon dioxide, and that is often produced from the agricultural sector. Food waste is an important issue, and some of these things are getting attention at the UN. But, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Water that it takes 2,200 gallons of water for one McDonald's burger. That's from having to grow all the food that feeds these cattle.
Right.
Yeah, I have a question. See, one of the little preface to that, in the Millennium Development Goals, several of them we fell short, especially in dealing with problems in developing world, primarily because goal number 8, namely the private-public partnership, issues where the developed world was to provide 0.7% GDP to solve the problems of the developing world, plus the technology access and so on, was not really achieved. In that context, now we come to the sustainability development goal. I know, especially in the context of India as well as in other developing countries, they've been clamoring for the West to provide them with technologies so they can transfer their energy economy from, heavy dependence on fossil fuel to renewables, as well as, help subsidizing those things, and those are in the sustainability. My question is, does UNEP have any strategy for it to succeed this time when it did not work in the Millennium Goals?
Right, right. Good question. There is a lot of work underway, thought being given to, this whole set of questions, both finance and technology. On the first of those, the finance side, there's quite a bit of attention going into the question of how to try to sort of green private sector investment, because there's a recognition that dramatically increasing levels of aid spending, official development assistance, is just very difficult in this current climate, and we can't do the job entirely through aid, so we have to look at greening the entire financial system, really. And in fact, UNEP put out we have something called the Finance Inquiry, which just launched its report this past week at the annual meeting of the World Bank and the IMF, a number of very luminary financial figures from around the world addressing that question. On the technology side, UNEP's been involved with something called the Climate Technology Center and Networks, which is officially the technology cooperation mechanism or arm under the climate treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's an effort to try to assist countries in accessing technologies, and we're looking at how to learn from that experience to look at the broader set of technologies that will be needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've been given the signal. Yes. One more? Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead. Thank you very much. So I actually have two questions regarding actually the forthcoming COP21. So one actually is that you mentioned about, so this actually will be a major one that will kind of shape the future roads. However, actually the signing countries actually are the kind of based on nation, but I know that a lot of the issue right now regarding sustainable development are actually coming from cities. So the first question would be, what kind of solutions or proposal or any kind of agenda that's actually kind of regarding cities and how that would be different from the last Millennium Goals. And the second question would be, so you also mentioned about the kind of international, transnational collaboration under this kind of COP21. So just wondering about a couple of major carbon emission countries like China, India, US. Are there any kind of future collaboration you actually will foresee that might actually emerge from the COP21 in Paris? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks. Well, on the question of cities, cities have been very, very heavily involved in climate change policy. And I was thinking about the discussion we had following your presentation about sort of multi-dimensional governance and things. And I've been very interested to see the number of subnational officials that have come to me and said, how can I do something at COP21 in Paris? There's a lot of enthusiasm from these city officials who are trying to work within their own cities to actually going to the international level and sharing experience and best practice. And in fact, Kyoto, even though the United States never ratified it, the goal was kind of informally adopted by quite a number of important cities around this country. The mayor, cities put forward their own plans for achieving the Kyoto targets, even though they didn't have to, because it wasn't ratified. So that's been very interesting to watch, and there's going to be a whole cities day at COP21 that's going to be hosted by the mayor of Paris, where there will be a large gathering, because people are basically seeing that there's just a lot of dynamism in the cities. That's kind of a level of governance where you can actually implement the policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions reductions and do it a lot more easily than changing national level policy, which is a hard thing to do in many places. So on the broader question of just initiatives coming out of Paris, I guess I would just point out that it has been recognized that Paris is about a lot more than the official agreement that's going to be reached there. As I was talking a bit about the various partnerships and initiatives, I just mentioned a few, but in the climate change space, there are lots of these. There's something called the Lima Paris Action Agenda that's very much part of the plans for Paris, which is sort of a parallel process alongside the official negotiations where hopefully these initiatives can be highlighted and again, ideally scaled up because there's a recognition that, you know, this isn't all going to be done through a sort of official treaty mechanism. Largely you have to mobilize people and industry and all kinds of actors, farmers, to get busy. Thanks.